The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello everyone, I'm Sean Esterly with the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, and welcome to today's webinar, which is hosted by the Clean Energy Solutions Center in the Global Buildings Performance Network. Today we're very fortunate to have Ryan Mears, Hans Olaf Carlson-Hurjor, Jens Lotson, and John Lee joining us. This great group of panelists will be discussing the Getting Building Codes Right, implementation, and enforcement. Now, one important note of mention before we begin our presentations is that the Clean Energy Solutions Center does not endorse or recommend specific products or services. Information provided in this webinar is featured in the Solutions Center's resource library as one of many best practices resources reviewed and selected by technical experts. And I just want to go over some of the webinar features today. You do have two options for audio. You can either listen through your computer or over your telephone. So if you choose to listen through your computer, please select the mic and speakers option in the audio pane. By doing that, you'll just eliminate the possibility of feedback and echo. And if you select the telephone option to call in today, a box on the right side will display the number and audio pin that you should use. Panelists, we just ask that you please mute your audio device while you are not presenting. And if anyone has technical difficulties with the webinar, you may contact the phone number at the bottom of that slide, which is 888-259-3826. And now we encourage the audience at any point to submit questions. Just feel free to type them into the question box, which is in the GoToWebinar pane, at any point throughout the webinar, and I will present those questions to the panelists at the end. If you're having difficulty viewing the materials through the webinar portal, we did post PDF copies of the presentations at the URL posted on that slide, and that is cleanenergysolutions.org/training, and you can use those to follow along. Also, within a day or two of today's webinar, we will post an audio recording to that site. Now, we do have a great agenda prepared for you today that's going to explore the current barriers to implementing rigorous enforcement systems for new buildings and present examples of good enforcement, other best practices for measures for supporting implementation, and then lessons learned from implementing such measures. And before our speakers begin their presentations, I just want to go over some short informative overview of the Clean Energy Solutions Center. And then following the presentations, we'll have a question and answer session, and then some closing remarks and a very brief survey. Now this slide provides a bit of background in terms of how the Solutions Center came to be. The Solutions Center is an initiative of the Clean Energy Ministerial and is supported through a partnership with UN Energy. It was launched in April of 2011 and is primarily led by Australia, the US, and other CEM partners. Some outcomes of this unique partnership include support of developing countries through enhancement of resources on policies relating to energy access, no-cost expert policy assistance, and peer-to-peer learning and training tools such as the webinar you're attending today. Now, there are four primary goals for the Solutions Center. It serves as a clearinghouse of clean energy policy resources. It also serves to share policy best practices, data, and analysis tools specific to clean energy policies and programs. The Solutions Center delivers dynamic services that enables expert assistance, learning, and peer-to-peer sharing of experiences. And then lastly, the Center fosters dialogue on emerging policy issues and innovation around the globe. So our primary audience for this is energy policymakers and analysts from governments and technical organizations in all countries. But then the Solutions Center also strives to engage with the private sector, NGOs, and civil society. And this slide highlights our Ask an Expert feature that the Solutions Center offers. So Ask an Expert is a great service offered through the Solutions Center at zero cost. So we've established a broad team of over 30 experts from around the globe who are available to provide remote policy advice and analysis to all countries. So for example, in the area of energy efficiency in buildings, we're very pleased to have Cesar Trevino, the leader of the Mexico Green Building Council, serving as our expert. So if you have a need for policy assistance on energy efficiency in buildings or any other clean energy sector, we do encourage you to use this useful service, which again is provided free of charge. So to request assistance, you simply submit your request by registering through our Ask an Expert feature at cleanenergysolutions.org/expert. We also invite you to spread the word about this service to those in your networks and organizations that may be interested. So in summary, we encourage you to explore and take advantage of the Solution Center resources and services, including the expert policy assistance, subscribe to our newsletter, and participate in webinars like these. And now I'd like to provide some brief introductions for our panelists today. The first panelist that we'll be hearing from is Jens Lassen, the Technical Director of the Global Buildings Performance Network. And then following Jens, we will hear from Ryan Mears, a Senior Code Compliance Specialist with the Institute for Market Transformation, where he works with state and local governments to improve compliance with building energy codes. He also works on the development of code change proposals to improve the understanding of the application of the International Energy Conservation Code to renovations. And then following Ryan, we will hear from John Lee. John is the Deputy Director for Green Buildings and Energy Efficiency at the New York City Mayor's Office of Long-Term Planning and Sustainability. In this capacity, he is leading the city's policy and legislative efforts, driving the built environment to unprecedented energy efficiency standards. And then our final speaker today is Hans Olaf Carlson Schedor of the Swedish National Board of Housing, Building, and Planning. Hans is head of the unit for the Sustainable Buildings and Construction Products. And so with those brief introductions, please join me in welcoming Jens to the webinar.
Sorry, we needed to get the microphone back on. As said, I'm Jens Lassen. I'm the Technical Director of the Global Buildings Performance Network. I sit here in Paris. It's a pleasure for me to welcome you all to this webinar. We have been working with building codes for nearly 2 years, and as part of this we have been scoring some of the best building codes against each other and try to come up with building codes that really drive the building consumption towards a zero, or at least bringing it very, very close to a zero, or bringing it significantly down. But all of these measures are nothing worth if the building code just stays as the prettiest paper in the world, then needs to have both implementation and enforcement. So therefore we saved one of the best parts to this last webinar. Let me dive into it. What is the idea of getting building codes right? We would like to, through these webinars, to share best practice experience on how to do things. It's as practical and as much about development and implementation of state-of-the-art building codes as possible. We tried to bring some of the best experts together to tell you about their experience by developing the building code. And as we heard already in the 2 previous webinars, this is a difficult task and there is a lot of stakeholders, and if we don't get them all in dialogue as it's shown on this slide, then it's difficult to get it right. We started out this series with discussing the importance of having targets and frequently revisions of building codes. So it's not just about establishing a very good building code and then we are safe for many years. No, you need to drive it forward, and as innovation go forward, we need to implement this and get better and better building codes. All of our 25 building codes have very good elements of this type built in. The second one is when you come close to a zero or you want to walk towards a zero, you need to go to performance in the end. You cannot continue just tightening the individual elements in your building code, but at a certain point you need to look at the building as a machine, try to look at how can we really drive the last bites of the energy consumption down so that we maybe end with our zero or positive energy. Again, we found a lot of very good experience from our 25 building codes, and we presented some of it in the last webinar. The last one, where we look at enforcement and learning from the best practice experience in trying to set up regimes like this, trying to control that people actually follow the building codes and see how this really comes from the paper out in the real world. That we found out in the process of looking at building codes. This is actually one of the most tricky and most challenging parts of building codes. It's where you have to work with communities, you have to work with citizens, you have to work with media, you have to work with everybody to get this in place, and you need to do training and many other things. We put the webinars online on our website, and you can download them, and we're working at making short extractions so it becomes easier to get the bytes that you really want. We also expect to do more of this in a paper version so that you can download a small paper trying to summarize both what we learned in the study before, but also what we learned from these webinars. As I said, we had the most challenging task when we started to compare how well are these codes implemented. When we looked at some of the other elements, we got scores on 10 and 9, and if not so good, the best were at 8. But when we looked at the performance, we came to the conclusion that all the countries have a lot to learn in particular this field. One of the elements that we found was often missing was the focus on this problem. So when we asked jurisdictions, do you have an evaluation on the implementation of your building code? How many % of the new buildings are actually fulfilling the requirements in the building code? It was very weak what we got back. And especially when we say, are those sources independent, or is it just people telling we think the building codes are working very well? So therefore, we came out with relatively poor scorings in the implementation. We also, here I stress it by putting the 3 elements of implementation next to each other. So there is the implementation and enforcement of the standard itself, there is certification, and the last one is the policy packages, which is supporting building codes. When we looked first at the enforcement standards, that's where we scored quite bad in all jurisdictions, and only Sweden came above the 5, which is the median score that was possible. We come back to these examples, and we hope to hear more about these kind of challenges and why it's not so well evaluated. Certification was a place where we found more and where some countries do relatively fine. And again, we found there was still missing some elements in doing the right policy package to drive your building code so that we get better and better performance and better building codes. The a special challenge which we tried to look at, and we hope to illustrate a bit more here today, was when you go from prescriptive building codes and you go to more performance-based building codes in your revision cycles, what is the lessons and what is new in implementation of a more performance-based building codes, which is maybe more complex. We looked at how these changes are reflected in the regimes, what models are used for enforcement, what finance mechanisms could drive this, what about training, education, awareness, and what about the final question, does this really give savings in the buildings in the end? Is the metered consumption also going down? It was a question we looked into, but it was very difficult to come up with the true story about this. We still see building codes as a very, very important part of building policies for new buildings, but it has to be a mix of sticks, carrots, and tambourines, we used to say. So the minimum requirements are the stick that we try to apply on people. You have to do this, otherwise we come after you. The next one is the carrots, the benefits that you get out of the building code, the finance system, the subsidy. And finally, the tambourines, where we give the message, this is a good idea for you, for the planet, for the people living in the building, and everybody. So we try to come around these kind of elements also when we talk about building codes. I hope all of the speakers here will stick with the idea of talking about how to implement building code and enforce them, and how you have been either successful or challenged in this process and what can be learned from it. I think that was what I would bring here. I hope to come back in the end with a very few concluding words, but otherwise I would leave the screen to the true experts, the people who work with this in their daily work. The first one I would hand over to is Ryan Myers from the Institute for Market Transformation in the US.
Yes, good morning, everyone. I'm loading up my presentation here, and I'll get started. So thanks, Jens. That was a great introduction to the webinar series and what we're trying to do in terms of addressing the enforcement issue and how to implement energy codes. So my presentation today is going to look at a U.S. perspective on what we're trying to do for building energy codes enforcement. First, a quick overview. Before I dive into the enforcement issue, I'm going to look at, do a quick overview of how codes are developed and adopted in the U.S. It's important to give the context of development and adoption in order to really understand why enforcement is an issue here and is one that we're trying to tackle, and believe that there are significant energy savings from that. So then I'll address some of the barriers that I come across in terms of enforcing the code, and then provide some solutions as I see them. So first of all, for development of energy codes in the U.S., it's important to note that the U.S. does not have a mandatory national energy code. The U.S. has what are referred to as model codes, and model codes are developed by two non-governmental organizations. One is ASHRAE, and they develop Standard 90.1, and also ICC, or the International Code Council, and they developed the International Energy Conservation Code. And each of those are on a 3-year development cycle. So the new codes are published every 3 years, and the process is open to all interested parties, which is why it often becomes quite complex and tedious, because anyone can provide input into the development of the codes, and ultimately governmental building officials are who vote for the final version of the code. When it comes to adoption of energy codes in the U.S., it's largely a state-level activity. There are a few exceptions where local jurisdictions, cities and counties, are responsible for adopting a code and not the state. And often when the states adopt codes, they'll make amendments. They like to change the code up to be specific to construction practices within their state. The map here is put out by the Building Codes Assistance Project, and it basically covers what level of energy code each state has for all the 50 states in the U.S. So now we dive into the enforcement side of things. Enforcement within the U.S. is largely a local or a city or county level responsibility. Its compliance is most commonly verified by local government officials. They do this by conducting a review of construction plans and also conducting on-site inspections to verify compliance. Now, that's really where the issues come in. I show an example here of New York State, and this is a map of each of the counties in New York State. And then the image to the right shows Orange County, which is one county within the state. And in Orange County alone, there's 44 cities and towns. And each of those cities and towns has the authority to enforce a building code, to enforce the state building code. So that's where you start to see that there are the reason that enforcement has not been addressed and is often shied away from, because it's a very difficult issue to tackle. There's across the entire U.S. there's over 3,000 counties, and then there's over 30,000 local jurisdictions, which includes cities and towns and villages. So there's a significant need for outreach to a very, very large audience of building officials who ultimately enforce the codes in every single city and town across the U.S. So of course the the reason that we're interested in this is that there's energy savings potential from good energy code enforcement. Even the best code on paper really doesn't mean much until it gets adopted and then enforced effectively. So this map here is actually from the IMT website. There's a link at the bottom of the page that has the full report. Basically, in last year, IMT did a study of all 50 states to determine what the energy savings potential was. And we didn't look at it as from a baseline of the current code. We looked at it from if the state enforced the code that they're under now, if they improved their compliance rate by 25%, what would the savings be? And if they improved it by 75%, what would the savings be? So that gives an idea. At the top, I cite $37.1 billion in lifetime savings for just 5 years of bringing construction into full compliance with the energy codes that are in place now. So next we start to look at the barriers. So obviously there's a lot of barriers that exist when it comes to enforcing the energy code. I think the most common, universal barrier, regardless of country, is really a lack of knowledge of the code and inadequate training provided to bring both code officials and also design professionals up to speed on what the energy code is with a revision cycle of every 3 years, and there are some states who will adopt every 3 years. It's often a big task for code officials and design professionals and builders to get up to speed on what the current code is. Next is inadequate funding. I think this is also a significant problem, but it's not one that cannot be overcome. The next one, lack of political will, is definitely a major issue that we come across here in the U.S. And sometimes it can be tough to overcome lack of political will. Global warming and climate change has become a very political issue here in the U.S. and a very polarizing one. And so, unfortunately, energy efficiency and energy code get lumped in with that, and often there's not political will to really enforce the energy code. And then various paths for compliance. Now, this is having multiple paths for demonstrating compliance. It can be a barrier, but it could also be lumped in with lack of knowledge and training, which it frequently is. You have a prescriptive path where you can simply follow the code, what the code says, and specify that on your plans, or a performance path where you're actually conducting an energy model to demonstrate compliance. And then the third one is an outcome-based compliance path, and this is not yet in the model codes. It is being proposed, but this is an outcome-based path is one that will look specifically at measured performance. So after the building is constructed, have you met the target that the code has set in place, and therefore demonstrate compliance after the building's been occupied. And then the last one is not knowing what compliance issues exist. This is one that we're coming across more and more frequently, in that building officials, they just don't really know where to start in terms of addressing issues because they don't know what issues they have within their jurisdiction. So that brings us to our first solution slide, and one of the biggest recommendations that I make is to conduct an assessment. You really need to determine what is broke in order to know how to fix it. And when it comes to an assessment for building energy codes, there's really two areas, and one is a quantitative assessment. This is one that allows you to compare, what your compliance number is versus other jurisdictions. It involves reviewing plans, doing on-site inspections, and just checking for what has been submitted and what code violations are observed on site versus what the code requirement is. So that gives you a number that says you have a 80% or a 50% compliance rate. And that's really just an estimated number, but it gives you an idea of where you are and where you need to go. The second one, which is really more in-depth, is a qualitative assessment, and that uncovers the reason of why. So for example, there's a lack of documentation. Maybe design professionals are not required to submit the appropriate documentation on their plans that shows that they're in compliance. It could be a lack of knowledge from the design professionals or from building officials. or it could be a poor process, or it could be political priorities that are uncovered that is the reason for noncompliance. So quantitative really gets to the number, but the qualitative side really gets at why those things are happening, why the compliance level is where it is. So then you need to develop a plan. You use the assessment as a means to see where the issues lie in order to develop a plan to improve that. So that you want to address both the quantitative issues. So if you observed within your assessment that fenestration or insulation is the most commonly cited violation, you want to focus some training efforts for industry and also for your code officials on how to address that, what the code requirements are, and what they should be looking for. But you should also draw from established best practices, and I show down here there's 5 images of case studies. These are covers of case studies that I've done over the past 2 years that really pull out what we've seen across the U.S. as best practice examples of how to implement and enforce the energy code. And they kind of range in topics from how to use third parties for plan review, how to use design professionals, how to make design professionals more accountable when it comes to code compliance, especially energy code compliance. And it also looks at local government processes. Often local governments in the U.S. and especially building departments, they're underfunded and they frequently don't have the most recent advances in technology to allow them to do things more efficiently. So that looks at some technological innovations that will improve the compliance process and thereby making code officials and building departments more efficient so that they can then take on the task of enforcing the energy code more effectively. Now I'll go into one example of the case studies, and this is the example here is from the state of Georgia. The state of Georgia implemented a state-level requirement for duct and envelope leakage testing for all residential construction of 3 stories or less. It's required that the testing be done by someone who's certified. It does not specifically have to be a third-party individual. A builder could get certified and conduct their own testing. And of course that would be verified by the local code official, but it would allow the builder to test their own homes as well as mechanical contractors and testing ductwork. But the state developed a one-day training program that would allow individuals to get certified, while at the same time they recognized that the common industry certifications could be accepted as well. So this, in the U.S., that's the Home Energy Rating System, the Building Performance Institute Building Analyst certification. Those are industry certifications that already exist that they recognize as individuals who can also perform this testing. And what it really does, this is the barrier that this addresses is a lack of resources for code officials in being able to do this. So their program actually relieves local code officials of having to do the testing themselves. So, obviously when it comes to energy code enforcement, it's where the rubber hits the road. It's really where the savings from the code that you've developed and got adopted are realized. And so as I close out here, here's my contact information. Please stay in touch if you have questions on energy code enforcement in the U.S. My email is there, as well as the IMT website, and all of the resources that I've shown here are available on the IMT website. So now I'm going to turn it over to John Lee from New York City. He's going to give you their local perspective on their energy code enforcement.
Thank you, Ryan. Can I confirm from Sean that you're able to see my screen?
Yep, see your screen and hear you just fine.
Great, thank you very much, Sean. And my name is John Lee. I'm with the New York City Mayor's Office, and I will be speaking to the enforcement program that was put together at the Department of Buildings pertaining to the New York City Energy Conservation Construction Code. I first wanted to go through just some background on the enforcement regime in New York City as it pertains to codes. And this first slide is partly to impress you out there in the audience that we are a city of nearly 8.3 million people. And within New York City is close to 1 million buildings. And the permit activity that's generated, that the construction is generated through construction is estimated to be somewhere to the order of $10 billion a year. And in order to address code compliance in general, I'm not talking about just the energy code, but the construction codes and the mechanical and plumbing codes and fuel gas codes that accompany that, the Department of Buildings employs over 1,000 persons, of which there are over 300 inspectors and almost 200 plan examiners that are distributed over several department offices, and they're primarily headquartered within each of the 5 boroughs that comprise New York City. You'll see that in 2011, nearly 500,000 plan reviews were conducted, and in total, about 143,000 work permits were issued. And this work permit application does generate a revenue source for the Department of Buildings. In fiscal year 2011, it generated about $165 million in revenues. Much of this was allocated towards the salaries of the personnel that went into conducting the plan examination and the inspections that accompany those permits. These over 1,000 employees covering the 144,000 work permits that were issued, what seems like a small standing army is actually inadequate in order to address the entire permit universe and volume that comes into New York City. And to that extent, much of the compliance is deferred to the licensed professional program that we call professional certification, by which a licensed engineer or a licensed architect can submit plans and attest to their full code compliance and be issued permits based on the good standing of their license. Those permit applications are then subject to a randomly selected enforcement audit, and the Department of Buildings maintains a 20% random selection rate, on which then drawings are pulled. If there is found to be not compliance issues that would warrant an amendment to the plans, then the department has the authority to place a stop work order on the permit until the compliance issues have been resolved. This also gives a mechanism to the department as a disciplinary action to go after someone's filing privileges with the department, again, based on their license, for those the worst actors and that would require the most deep enforced or punitive measure. One thing I will also add before I leave this slide is wanted to show on the upper right-hand side of the slide is the permit volume for Manhattan, and then below that is Brooklyn, and Manhattan and Brooklyn being the 2 largest boroughs in terms of construction activity in New York City. Please note first that the y-axis scale on here are slightly different. But I just wanted to point out that there's a distinction made on this slide between what's called an NB Alt 1 versus Alt 2 and Alt 3. And that's just describing the kinds of permits that are issued by the Department of Buildings. NB refers to new building. Alt 1 is a significant alteration that changes the use of the building. And then Alt 2 and 3 are the more minor alterations that would typically be considered a renovation or repair. This is actually a fairly crude way to describe a very nuanced picture. Within this universe of Alt 2 and 3, it can be as significant as a full apartment renovation is considered an alteration, or even just a a swap of a sprinkler fire pump would be considered a minor alteration too. And then within New York City, even though there may be an overarching new buildings permit that is pulled, the regime allows for any construction job to be chopped up into multiple permits across several disciplines. So any given job site may have a dozen, 2 dozen different permits pulled for that job related to their separate disciplines, again, around construction activity. Again, they could be carved up in many different ways, and also mechanical systems, electrical and plumbing systems could be permitted separately. Within New York City, there is a large degree of local jurisdictional control over the building codes. Earlier in Ryan's presentation, he showed the county-by-county breakup of New York State, which is subject to the New York State construction codes. However, in New York City, and this is part of the executive law in New York City, New York State, the city of New York is allowed to legislate their own building codes and take enforcement action independent of the rest of New York State. The way that it works around energy codes is slightly different, and I won't get too deep into the nuance, but just to say that there is an overarching New York State Energy Conservation Construction Code, and in 2009, New York City legislated its own New York City Energy Conservation Code, which is based on the background New York State Code. Again, this is also based on the International Code Council's Model Energy Conservation Code. And what this did, which was the most important thing that happened in 2009, was under the state code that was in effect at that time, there was this so-called
schedule of a building project is that the developer has got an idea and he starts to design. Then he notices the municipality building board about the project, and then the municipality invites the developer to a technical consultation where the developer presents the project. And together the building board and the developer takes and makes a control plan that is agreed on, and the control responsible person is presented by the developer, and the building board has to approve this person to be the control responsible. And at this stage, a starting permission is given by the building board. And during the erecting phase, the control responsible performs controls decided in the control plan. And for the energy control, there are two different phases. First, you can tell the developer or the control responsible to do control of calculated values during the project as the project proceeds. And then there is a second phase, and that is the control of the measured values that are measured during the second season of use. And the building board can, depending on how well known and the competence of the organization of the developer, the building board decides whether or which of these methods that are appropriate to apply on the certain project. And when if they are told to make the both checks, when it differs between the two methods, the second method, the control of the measured values, is the reference method. So that makes the developer to develop projects that are has got a safety meridional. And so far in Sweden we have the country divided in 3 climatic zones. We are starting to change that, but so far we use the 3 zones. And the safety meridian in these zones is, as you know, Sweden as a country stretching from the south to the north. The zones are divided, so there are about 3 similar size areas. And if you're looking at the buildings built in one of those zones, you see in the north, in the coldest part of the zone, the building, the safety meridional is about 10%. And in the south part of the climate zone, it's between 35 or 40% better than the building code. During the using phase, when the building is finished, the building board gives the developer a permit, which is a must to be allowed to use the building. But when it comes to energy and radon, the permit is just an interim permit. For radon, it's because in Sweden you have to measure radon during the heating season, and if the building is finished in the summer, you can't present a radon measurement. And energy, because of the second point of the compliance control plan. And sanctions not doing this that could be used by the building board is that the owner can be told not to be allowed to use the building, or they can get an injunction of correction, or when it's very bad, perhaps not when it comes to energy, but to other requirements such as strength and so of the building, it could be an injunction of demolition. And to correct this, there could be a fine deemed. And as the national board has nothing to do with this process with the control responsible and the developer and the building board, we have some years ago, according to the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive, started to do some energy certificates that went in force in the beginning of 2007. And this building certificates is to be presented according to the period measured in the point 7 of the control plan. So these 2 laws, or they are strengthening each other's. And why we have choose to use measured values? Well, before 2006, we had calculated values to show the energy use. And then we found out when checking out there could be projects that differed up to 250% of the calculated values. And since we changed from calculated to measured values, we have seen a decrease in the energy use in this certification register since this control system went into force. And this, when it takes part of the control system, the municipality chooses within the two ways of handling the compliance checks in the control plan. But the energy certificate always has to be made. And the role of the National Board of Housing, Building and Planning is that we have got the checking if the certificates are made. And the effect of this, when we are following the energy statistics in the National Energy Certificate Register, we can see a trend of lower energy use in buildings erected after the operational ratings compliance checks was introduced in 2006. And there's been some difficulties since the municipalities once in a while doesn't choose any of the methods. Before 2012, the municipalities had the supervision over the energy certificates. It wasn't always checked as it should have been. And in some cases, the building is sold before it is ready, and then there is a demand that you should have an energy certificate already when you sell it, and then you can only make the compliance check out of this energy certificate that is only calculated. So there's some problems. And this was my presentation. Hello.
Great, thank you very much. And thank you to the rest of the presenters for the wonderful presentations today. We do, at this point, we have quite a few questions from the audience, so we'll move on to those and address those. And I'd just like to remind the audience that if they do have any questions, please submit them through the questions bar or pane in the GoToWebinars box there on your screen. And so the way we'll do the question and answer session is I will read out the questions that I've received. If some of these are addressed to specific panelists, but if they are not, then feel free to just unmute yourself and address the question. And so the first one that I received today just asked, so with building codes, this was during the first presentation during Ryan's, they were asking if the building codes are not mandatory, how would they be enforced if they are voluntary?
Yeah. Okay, this is Ryan. I'll take that. Good question. So the building codes are not mandatory at the national level. When a state adopts a code, it then becomes mandatory with a state or local jurisdiction, being a city or a county. Then it becomes mandatory. I just wanted to make the point that at the national level, there is not a mandatory code. There's only model codes, which the states then adopt as mandatory.
Great, thank you. And Ryan, this next one's for you too. They were wondering where the case studies that you were referencing can be found, or if they are available.
Yes, they're all available. You can go to imt.org, and you'll find them under the Codes tab there.
Great, and I'll send up that link as well. That was imt.org.
Yep, imt.org, yep.
And the next question we have is, does the energy inspections and analysis, do they have to be completed by an external resource, or can it be done by a qualified building and housing resource?
You want me to take that?
Sure, yeah.
Okay. I'll do a quick, in terms of this is Ryan, in terms of my presentation when it came to the actual assessments, so they can be done internally or by a third party, a consultant that's brought in. But it's really up to the jurisdiction that is that's conducting it.
Great, thank you.
I can also answer from Sweden. The assessors of the certification system so far has been mandatory to belong to an accredited company, and there is 3 different types of accreditation, where one of them are that you can be a part of the company, but then you have to be in a well-divided part of the company, so they don't they're not allowed to work within the same part of the company that is erecting the building, but normally it is done by a third party.
Great, thank you. And the next question we have states, in New York City and other cities, is there any effort to verify energy models beyond looking at the proposed energy costs compared to the budget?
This is John Lee from New York City. Yes, that is part of the verification process that the new plan examiners will be conducting, that along with the energy cost budget model form that is submitted, they also have to, if they are picked up for an audit or as part of a prior to approval plan examination, they will have to demonstrate the correlations between their energy model and what was inputted into the energy cost budget to confirm the validity of the model.
Great, thank you. And we have 2 questions that are in regards to the ARA program. The first is there a system in place to check the compliance rates in New York or the U.S. in general as part of ARA? And the second part to that question is, is there any information on the progress achieved by the ARA program? Has it made a significant impact on code compliance?
I guess, again, this is John Lee, and I guess that this question is directed towards me since I'm the one that brought it up. But I would say, and I apologize for this being very bureaucratic, but I can't really comment on that because it's not part of the city's obligation here at this point. Again, this is something that's deferred to the state, and while the activity that we are doing for compliance will ultimately feed into the state's program to demonstrate their compliance with 90/17. We are under no obligation as a city to implement and develop that plan. So again, I apologize for the bureaucratic answer, but I would rather defer to other experts to answer that question.
Yeah, this is Ryan. I can take that one. I can give the non-bureaucratic answer to that. So the Department of Energy did a series of pilot studies a couple of years ago to come up with a methodology for conducting compliance assessments. They more or less expect the states to then take that methodology or some version thereof and conduct their own assessments. However, currently there's no funding dedicated to the states to be able to do that. It's the responsibility of these states to take on that obligation of conducting their own assessments and then reporting their results to the Department of Energy.
Great, thank you. And the next question is for Hans-Olav, and the question is, how frequently are fines imposed for non-compliance?
Well, I don't have the figure of that because that is within the municipalities. But since we last year took over the checking of the energy certificates, we have been sending out a lot of letters to building owners that hasn't done their homework, so to say. We have a possibility to force them to make energy certifications, and that is within the whole system of energy certification. So could also be in elder buildings that is within the system. So I don't have quite the figure yet, but we are so far we have I think sent out letters to owners of about 10,000 buildings to do energy certifications. So, and this register of ours, we are going to plan a cooperation with the Society of Municipalities to do some work to make it easier for the municipalities to use our certification register to go in and check. So if they tell us that there is a new building built, we well, we can get that also from the land survey authority, and then we can tell the building owner to make a new buildings certificate, and the municipality can force them to do it with the fines and so on.
Great, thank you, Hans-Ola. And the next question brings us back to the New York City, and it asks, what is New York City's definition of an alteration type 1? Is it based on value or on the area affected by the works? And is it similar to the EU definition of major renovation?
I wouldn't characterize that definition as being similar to anyone else's, and it's fairly nuanced. I guess the easiest way to describe it is that the alteration type 1 is a significant alteration that ultimately changes the use of the building. And that would help caveat also what is described as an alteration type 2, which can also be a major alteration but is not affecting the main use of the building. So again, I would not align it with other jurisdictions' definitions, but just for the ease of doing these high-level metrics and also trying to describe the universe that's in New York City, I drew those distinctions along these lines, but I would emphasize that you have to take into consideration that these aren't very neat definitions, and the most clear distinction being that change of use between an Alt 1 and an Alt 2.
All right, thank you. And another question for New York City, and it asks, could you speak about how the building department enforces energy code violations? Is it through stop work orders, fines, or otherwise? And also, do they have any energy code items that have to be verified post-certificate of occupancy?
With the scheme that's in place for the new building and alteration type 1 applications that are subject to the energy code review, they cannot pull a permit until they demonstrate full compliance on the construction drawings with the energy code. It is only then that they get the permit. For all other jobs that are subject to a random selection audit, in many cases the permit has already been issued. But through the enforcement audit, if they're find that there are non-compliance issues that need for the drawings to be amended and the scope of work possibly amended, then the department can issue a stop work order on the permit until the objections have been resolved. In terms of the inspections, there is a prior to closeout progress inspection requirement. So if any of the inspection items have either been unfulfilled or failed and were not corrected, then the applicant can't submit that final progress inspection report, and which means that the permit would not be closed out, which subsequently means that the certificate of occupancy will not be issued. Those are the major actions that the Department of Buildings can take in terms of how it will affect the progress of the permit.
Great, thanks. And back to Hans Olof for this question. How are the operational energy targets in Sweden developed for complex commercial buildings?
Well, so far, until the next alteration of building codes, we have only so far worked with residential and non-residential building codes, and also we have difference between electrical heated and not electrical heated buildings. But if the building has got different types of well, a mix of non-residential and residential, it's divided into the area of the area of the sort of well, you have the part of where the dwelling has to comply to the dwelling code, and the part with the non-residentials has to comply with that part, and it's sort of a mix.
Great, thank you, Hans Olof. And the next question is to any panelist, and it is: financing is always an issue with increasing training or improving other methods to achieve better code compliance. How have you seen ways of tackling this issue?
This is Ryan. I guess I'll take a stab at that one. I'm not sure I followed the question completely, but I think it's in reference to funding for code compliance initiatives. And one of the case studies that I did is on streamlining, and that's probably the one that addresses it certainly addresses the issue from the local jurisdiction standpoint, in that it essentially puts out there solutions and methods that local building departments can follow in order to streamline their processes, and which almost always will lead to them being able to do things more quickly and efficiently, and therefore allowing them time to focus on the energy code. And that's without specifically allocating funding for it, because oftentimes, trying to implement a new fee or raise permit fees becomes a very political issue. And so this is a way to be able to get compliance without specifically having to raise fees or try to bring on other staff in order to do that.
This is Jens. I would like to tip in here too.
Okay.
Let's go with Jens first, and then we'll go on to the other panelists.
Was it to me? I would like to tip in that there is a couple of places where we have seen that you pay a fee for the building permit, and this way you pay for some of the control, or as the case, I guess we will tip in on this one too, that you request a certification which is made by an independent consultant, and you have to pay for him to submit this certificate for the community so that they can check whether you fulfill the requirement or not. And if the price for a thing like that is a couple of €100 or a couple of $100 it's a very little price compared to the construction cost just of a one-family house, which might be $500,000 or even more. So it's not a very big amount that you need to claim from those people. And then at least the City Hall doesn't have an excuse not to enforce the building code because they get money to do it. So that's one possibility.
Yeah, and Hans-Olof here. Well, in Sweden, the developer has to, according to the law, has to know about buildings and so on, but the municipality judges the organization around the developer to see if it's good enough, so to say. And if they find that the organization around the developer hasn't got the skills of energy, for example, showed in their background papers and so on, they can tell the developer to hire an energy expert that is certified. And it's the same kind of energy expert that can make, but not this, couldn't be the same one, but same type of energy expert doing the certificate of the building later on. So if the developer hasn't got an energy expert in his organization, they have to hire one certified to be able to. And then there is the certified control responsible to check the project during the time of the project.
Great, thank you, Hans-Olof and Jens. We have time for one more quick question. If everyone, I believe this applies to everyone, if you could just maybe 20 seconds providing an answer to this, it would be great. The question is, are there additional references, studies for enforcement procedures, templates, things like that, any resources that our audience could use to find out more about any aspects of this? And we can go right in order with Ryan first, if you have some additional references or studies for the audience.
I'm not going to name a specific one, but I'll bring up a resource, and it's energycodesocean.org, and that is a website run by the Building Codes Assistance Project, and they have a compliance portal on there, which has a wide variety of ways to improve compliance.
Great, and John or Hans-Olof, if you had anything.
This is John Lee from New York City. I would point to the New York City Department of Buildings website, which is at www.nyc.gov/buildings. And there's an entire page devoted to energy code guidelines. And what I would like to say is that the presentation I gave was pretty high level, but when it comes down to the very nuanced and detailed definitions and methods by which specific items would be regulated, they are laid out in much more excruciating detail on the Department of Buildings website through a number of bulletins which describe procedures and policies that aren't clearly addressed by the codes, as well as general guidance on how to conform to the New York City regime.
And also here, and I can give one link as well, and that is to the implementation, the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive, a booklet featuring country reports from 2012 with the different countries involved in the Concerted Action for Energy Performance of Buildings Directive. And that is www.epbd-ca.eu, where I think you can find this booklet describing the different countries of Europe and all the different parts of the energy work according to the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive, where there are the demands for the levels of the building codes and the certification of buildings and so on.
Great, thank you. And now real quick, we're going to go back over to Jens, who wanted to make some closing remarks before we finish up. And I just ask the audience to stick around. Also, we have a very brief survey that we'll do after that.
Thank you. I will mention a paper too made by the World Bank called Mainstreaming Building Energy Efficiency Codes in Developing Countries, which is made by Feng-Liu, Anke Meyer, and John Hogan. Some of them might be known to you anyway. I would also thank everybody who have participated in these webinars and who have helped us to scope up new material discussions on how to implement good building codes. We thank all the speakers. It was our aim to get people, those everyday heroes who are developing building codes and trying to implement them, and very often they are not getting well treated for that, and they never get an award or a thing like that. They work in silence, and this was an idea of having some of them to tell about their experiences, which other people could learn a lot from, and we have learned a lot ourselves. To mention the team here, and especially Neil McDonald's, who have been putting these webinars together and done the work with comparison, talking with the speakers, and all of these things. So I hope it has been useful for all of you, and we would like to come back soon. Maybe we will focus next time on renovation policies, but we could definitely also in the future come back with something about building codes in maybe in hot and humid climates where it's a different task again. So I hope you got something out of these webinars. We definitely did. And we hope to see you back in webinars again in the future. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Jens. And now we just ask the audience to answer 3 quick survey questions that we have that just help us improve the webinar and get some feedback. Maureen, if you could show that first question, please. And the question is, the webinar content provided me with useful information and insight. And the next question. The webinar's presenters were effective. And then the final question. Is overall the webinar met my expectations? Great, thank you very much for answering our survey. And on behalf of the Clean Energy Solutions Center, I'd just like to thank the panelists and the attendees for participating in today's webinar. Please go out to the Clean Energy Solutions Center.org training page over the next few days if you'd like to listen to an audio recording of today's webinar and view the slides. They are posted, the slides are posted up there right now. The audio recording will take a few days to get up there. And feel free to share this information with those in your networks and organizations. So thank you, and this concludes our webinar.